Give me that drink. Have one on me.
All I want is to enter my house justified.
All you can buy up these stairs is a bullet in the head.
Hello and welcome to The Road to Contention, a series about westerns. Each episode I'm going to be talking about one of my favourite western movies or TV shows, telling you why I love it so much, and discussing how it fits into the history of the genre.
I want to stop on the road to contention.
I think it's fair to say that the western is not especially popular in commercial cinema right now. Aside from recent work by Quentin Tarantino and the Coen brothers, as well as Antoine Fuqua's star-studded Magnificent Seven remake, there hasn't been much in the way of large-scale mainstream Hollywood westerns lately, although art house filmmakers like Kelly Reichardt have continued to make vital work within the genre. Many people look down on westerns, particularly the ones from the classic Hollywood era, regarding them as simplistic and conservative morality tales of white hats versus black hats and cowboys versus Indians. Stories where rugged, tough, masculine heroes are celebrated and women are consigned to the background. And so, while in this series I'd like to discuss westerns from many different countries and time periods by a diverse array of filmmakers, I want to start by making a case for films from the classic Hollywood era by filmmakers like John Ford, Anthony Mann, Howard Hawks, and Nicholas Ray. However, I believe if you love something, you shouldn't be afraid to focus on its flaws, knowing that anything truly great can withstand a critical viewpoint. One of the most widely cited and serious flaws of the classic Hollywood Western was the often racist way they presented Native American characters, and that's what I want to discuss now, focusing on one of my favourite Westerns from that era, a film which offers a very different view of Native Americans to a lot of its contemporaries. Anthony Mann's 1950 masterpiece Devil's Doorway is a remarkably radical film for its time, and remains so today. The protagonist, known alternately by the names Lance Bull and Broken Lance, is a Native American, specifically a Shoshone, and a decorated veteran of the American Civil War, having won a Medal of Honor for his service.
I led a squad of white men. Slept in the same blankets with them, ate out of the same pan. Held their heads when they died.
Returning home to Wyoming after the war, he hopes to integrate into American society and live peacefully as a cattle rancher on his patch of land known as Sweet Meadows.
No man, red or white, will ever be turned away from our door.
However, he soon finds himself disabused of that notion, as the white people from the neighbouring town treat him with scorn and disdain, the town's doctor refusing to attend to his dying father, and a local lawyer, Vern Coolin, played wonderfully with arrogant malice by Louis Calhern, stirring up racist resentment against him.
That's a big horse you're riding there. It's a long fall off of it.
As sheep farmers arrived from neighbouring territories hoping to claim Lance's land through the Homestead Act, a law which allowed people to claim a patch of land, providing they could say they'd improved it, Lance finds himself having to take up arms and defend the place where he and his fellow Shoshone live. While the lawyer Coolin is the ostensible bad guy, playing on the fears, prejudices, and desperation of his fellow whites to his own advantage, the film's true antagonists are colonialism, the United States of America, and the law itself.
Legally, we could go into Sweet Meadows right now. Isn't that right?
As Wyoming becomes an American territory and falls under federal law, Lance realizes that his status as a ward of the government gives him fewer rights than a white man. He's not able to own land or even have a drink in a bar.
He's always been a good boy.
Lance has two white allies, Zeke, an old friend of his father who becomes a local marshal, and Ori, played by Paula Raymond, a lawyer who decides to represent him.
He certainly earned the right to live.
While many lesser films would play up the heroism of these two characters, presenting them as white saviors, this film firmly rejects such notions. While portrayed sympathetically, both characters are shown to fundamentally fail Lance, because even though they can clearly see that the laws of the land are unjust, they still feel that it's their sacred duty to uphold them.
It's the law, and we have to abide by it.
As such, the film presents racism not just as a personality defect of certain individuals, but an intrinsic part of American society itself, which even apparently good liberal people can help perpetuate. Devil's Doorway's incredible final act, which contains some of the best action scenes of the classic Hollywood era, shows Lance and his band of Shoshone braves as they arm themselves with rifles and dynamite and take on their white oppressors in a series of battles that have as many explosions as the average Michael Bay movie.
Cool guys don't look at explosions.
If you haven't seen it, you might not believe that a film as radical as Devil's Doorway could have been made in Hollywood during the 50s. While the film was not a huge hit, nor was it especially well regarded critically at the time, its radicalism did not go entirely unnoticed, as it was the communist newspaper The Daily Worker's Film of the Year for 1950. However, in my description so far, I have conspicuously left absent Devil's Doorway's big flaw, one which undercuts a lot of the power of its messaging. Broken Lance, the protagonist of the film, is played by a white man, the actor Robert Taylor, and most, but not all of the other Shoshone characters are likewise portrayed by whites. Robert Taylor's performance is undeniably great, and it's also true that this film could never have been made without a famous white movie star like Taylor to sell it. Casting white actors in Native American parts was standard practice in the era, and remained so for a long time afterwards. Even as recently as 2013, Johnny Depp's casting as Tonto in The Lone Ranger provoked controversy. These are excuses though. Fundamentally, casting a white actor to play a Native American role is racist and wrong. As great as Taylor is in this role, the film would be elevated enormously were an actual Shoshone to play the lead. Political correctness aside, it would make the film greatly more powerful. What are we to make of this film then? Is its aesthetic quality and political radicalism so undercut by its casting that it should be beneath our consideration? Or are we to avoid judging films of yesteryear from the moral perspective of today? These are, I think, unanswerable questions, or certainly at least, unanswerable by me.
Get him out of here.
However, I think it might be interesting and useful to discuss the film in the context of portrayals of Native Americans in the westerns made up to that point, as well as exploring some of the film's antecedents, as Devil's Doorway was not, believe it or not, the first western to centre a Native American perspective, nor the first to take their side in conflict with white America.
You used to shoot the Indian down. Now you cheat him and starve him and kill him off by dirt and disease. It's a massacre any way you take it.
Most people are familiar with the stereotypes of Native Americans portrayed in the westerns of classical Hollywood, and for the most part, it is true that many of the films of the era presented Native Americans as savages, occasionally noble but mostly just vicious. The western as a genre originated as a form of propaganda to first justify and then mythologize the ideology of manifest destiny, which stated that God himself had ordained whites with the duty to occupy and civilize the land that the Native Americans inhabited.
What do they always yell for?
I don't know.
In many old Hollywood westerns, Native Americans would be portrayed as a challenge for the heroes to deal with, providing a necessary action beat to liven up the plot. In films like The Iron Horse, The Covered Wagon, The Big Trail, Stagecoach, or Red River, the characters would be undertaking an epic journey across the American landscape, and an Indian attack would be one of the various obstacles they'd overcome along the way.
Fire the tackle!
It's almost as if they belong to the same category as a rock slide or river rapids. They show up, shoot arrows at the hero with little to no motivation or characterization, then get defeated so the plot can move on.
There we go. I guess we was just a little too much for him.
What do you make of it?
Indians.
As a side note, Anthony Mann, the director of Devil's Doorway, wonderfully subverts this trope in his 1954 film The Naked Spur. In that film, James Stewart and his ragtag group are escorting a wanted man through the wilds of Colorado and end up fighting a band of Blackfoot. Yet rather than being set upon by the Blackfoot with no explanation or motive, as would happen in most films of this era, it is established that one of the white characters had raped one of the chief's daughters, and now they have come looking for him. Indeed, it is the white rapist who takes the first unprovoked shot, firing at the entirely reasonable and blameless Blackfoot from concealment. When Native Americans did get more extensive characterization in westerns than mere bullet fodder, their otherness and savagery was often emphasized, and little attention was paid to accuracy in regards to costume, culture, or language.
Native Americans, I want to say much like African Americans, were sort of props. Rather than try to make them look regional, everybody was identifiable. So They weren't interested in explaining the tribes. They said, well, they're Indians.
Famously in the 1939 film Scouts to the Rescue, the actors playing Native American characters spoke in English and had their dialogue reversed in post to make them speak backwards, apparently an approximation of how the filmmakers thought Native Americans talked. However, there was a countervailing trend going back to the silent era of filmmakers attempting to portray Native Americans with more accuracy and sensitivity. A small handful of films, including The Daughter of Dawn from 1920 and The Silent Enemy from 1930, were made with the express intention of accurately presenting the lives of indigenous people. Both films, however, are set prior to the arrival of white settlers, and the main conflicts occur within the tribes themselves. In fact, both have near identical plots, where the characters are threatened by scarcity of food and need to travel to find a new source, hunger being the eponymous silent enemy of the 1930 film. Also in both films, there is a love triangle where the brave warrior protagonist battles against a morally corrupt rival of the chief's daughter. What's extraordinary about these films is not their narratives, however, but their docudrama depiction of tribal life within the Kiowa and Comanche nations in the case of The Daughter of Dawn, and the Ojibwe in the case of The Silent Enemy. The films were very much presented as collaborations with the people they depicted. The Silent Enemy, while mostly a silent film, features an opening sound monologue by one of the cast, Chief Yellow Robe, who thanks the white filmmakers for depicting their lives authentically.
Look not upon us as actors. We are living our own life today as we lived it yesterday.
In addition to the aforementioned docudramas, there are a few films in the silent era and the 1930s that dealt explicitly with white racism and framed Native American heroes fighting against white antagonists. However, these of course tended to have white men playing the leading role. One example from 1916 is The Half-Breed, made by Alan Dwan. It stars silent superstar Douglas Fairbanks in the title role. The film is about Lo Dorman, the son of a white man and a Native American woman. His mother leaves him in the care of another white man who lives in a remote shack in the mountains. Then she commits suicide. Lo is therefore half white, raised entirely by a white man, and yet his parentage still leads him to be stigmatized. While progressive for a film made by white people in 1916, it's still fairly limited as a condemnation of racism. The other Native Americans who appear in the film are presented as backwards drunkards who set the forest fire which causes the film's climactic drama. This almost makes it seem as though the point of the film is not that racism is wrong per se, but that racism specifically against our protagonist is wrong, because in most important respects, he is white. One of the most striking aspects of the film is its portrayal of sexuality, with not one but two potential white love interests for Lo, both of whom are portrayed as, well, incredibly horny for him. Partly this may have something to do with Fairbanks' emerging sex symbol status, and the fact of the actor's obvious whiteness likely distracted from the shock at the time, but it's nevertheless noteworthy given that anti-miscegenation laws were being added to the books in many American states in this era. The Vanishing American from 1925 has several plot points in common with Devil's Doorway. The film explores the difficulties faced by a Navajo tribe as they are forced into a reservation overseen by a racist agent. White movie star Richard Dix plays the lead role, a warrior named Nofaye. As with Devil's Doorway, the Native American characters hope to gain acceptance by fighting for America, this time in World War I, only to find themselves subject to more racism on their return. The Vanishing American also provides a white love interest for its hero, but they are unable to consummate their love before the hero's tragic death, and she ultimately ends up with a good and sympathetic white man. Romantic relationships between Native Americans and whites continue to be a running theme in westerns, and as we'll discuss later, this does crop up in Devil's Doorway.
Would your conscience say it's worth kissing me?
There's obviously a potential for portrayals of this sort to be anti-racist, but they can fall into tropes that end up further exoticizing, othering, and objectifying Native Americans. One common trope of a white character having a squaw or Indian wife is often played for laughs, as in The Searchers or The Covered Wagon, where the butt of the joke is the Native American wife's greater subservience and her lack of sexual appeal. Perhaps the predecessor that comes closest to matching Devil's Doorway's radicalism is Massacre, a film from 1934 starring Richard Barthelmess as Chief Joe Thunderhorse, a Sioux who has left the reservation to become a famous rodeo star, now trading on his heritage as a gimmick in his performances. When he's summoned back to see his dying father, he finds that his people are hideously oppressed and exploited by the agents operating the reservation, and decides to fight back. As the film was made prior to the adoption of the Hays Production Code, which censored cinema according to very conservative moral criteria, Massacre is shockingly blunt in its portrayal of racism, including a plotline where the protagonist's sister is raped by one of the film's villains.
What's the matter?
Guys like you don't come in pairs.
While the ending is neat and hopeful in a way that strikes false alongside the rest of the film, Massacre is not afraid to place its aim squarely at not just racist individuals, but American society at large for the repugnant treatment of America's indigenous population. Additionally, the film features the most badass car chase you'll ever see in a film from 1934, or any other time for that matter. One other film that must necessarily be talked about in conjunction with Devil's Doorway is Delmer Dave's Broken Arrow, which was also released in 1950 and was marketed and lauded as a breakthrough in the depiction of Native Americans in cinema. The film stars James Stewart as Tom Jeffords, a former soldier who takes it upon himself to negotiate for peace with the Apache leader Cochise, played by Jeff Chandler, again a white man.
Is it not possible that your people and mine can someday live together like brothers?
A lot of the film plays as a hagiography of Jeffords, a real historical figure, and much is made of his enlightenment and lack of racism as compared to his fellow whites. Having spared a young Apache boy and then been in turn spared by an Apache war party, Jeffords comes to realize that whites and Apaches aren't so very different after all. He then starts his peace mission, learning the language of the Apache and riding out to meet with Cochise, with whom he eventually forms a friendship.
We will not spit on each other.
The film is aged very poorly, partially as a result of the sentimental liberal bromides it peddles, but mostly because of the romance between Jeffords and a young Apache girl named Sunsere, played by a 15-year-old Deborah Paget in horrendous brown body paint. Oh my god. Every time I see the two characters kiss, I involuntarily wince, half due to her being an actual child, with Stewart being in his early 40s at this point, and half due to the fact that you feel as though her skin colour might well smear off on his face. Devil's Doorway potentially, however, does owe its existence in part to Broken Arrow. The former film was purportedly shelved due to its depressing tone and controversial subject matter, and the success of Broken Arrow convinced distributors MGM to actually release it. Contemporary critics link the two films together in their reviews, largely seeing Devil's Doorway in the shadow of the other film. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of Broken Arrow is the Apache wedding poem, popularized by the film. It is recited at the nuptials of Jeffords and Sunsere, and famously begins,
"Now for you there is no rain, for one is shelter to the other."
It is still commonly recited at American weddings to this day. The poem is in fact in no way Apache, but instead originated from the novel Blood Brother, the book on which Broken Arrow is based, and was an invention of its white author, Elliot Arnold. This sentimental faux traditional concoction seems tailored to be easily appropriated by its white audience, evoking a sense of cultural universality, despite just referring back to familiar Western monogamous romantic tropes. Devil's Doorway's depiction of Native American culture, meanwhile, is far more nuanced and interesting than the sentimental caricature of Broken Arrow, although it still contains pitfalls of its own.
I send you, my father, to the land of the great mystery.
One of the most striking sequences in the film comes when Ori, Lance's lawyer and potential love interest, comes to visit his home at Sweet Meadows with her mother. Ori has just explained to Lance that he has fewer legal rights than a white man, and as such cannot own the land that his family has lived on for generations.
It's the law, and we have to abide by it.
I see your point.
Lance responds with a brilliant and bitter speech, scornfully describing the law as a faith, like a religion.
I've always wanted something like that. Something to tell me what's right or wrong.
This framing is fascinating given that we have an indigenous person describing Western ideals of law and property rights, almost in the same tone and manner a contemporary white settler might describe the so-called backwoods traditions of a Native American tribe.
He's telling me about the Indians.
Heathen, idle accursed belief that 1,000 dead men will rise to take the place of those that die. They're not praying. It's only an excuse to kill.
Ori and her mother get ready to storm off, with Ori's mother perceiving Lance's contained and justified anger as a threat, brandishing her rifle and saying,
"We are armed."
When suddenly a young Shoshone boy runs through the field towards them and faints from exhaustion. Ori and her mother want to help him, but Lance prevents them and the three of them stand over him as he weakly crawls towards the house on his own. Lance explains that the boy was undergoing a ritual where he had to spend 3 days in the mountains and return with the talons of an eagle. Ori describes the tradition as cruel, to which Lance responds that it is necessary for Shoshone men to prove their strength, as they may need to defend their community.
Shoshones are a small tribe. Every man counts. Suppose one day that boy had to fight for his people.
A point on which he's tragically proved right by the end of the film.
Here's that gun you wanted. Take good care of it.
Once the boy makes it home, Ori and her mother see the great care and pride with which Lance and the other Shoshone treat him.
Well, you made it, Shining Spear. You're a man now. We're proud of you.
The white characters then begin to come around, and Ori's mother declares,
"That boy's got a good home."
And so we are given a sequence in which the white characters are challenged on two fronts. Firstly, by having their own ideals, which they had believed universal and immutable, presented to them from another perspective, from which they seem arbitrary and subject to change. Secondly, by seeing a tradition from another culture that first seems cruel, yet gradually understanding the reasoning behind it, and realizing the people who practice it are equally as capable of compassion and humor.
You won't have any trouble sleeping tonight.
As Lance escorts Ori and her mother home, they encounter a group of Shoshone, mainly old men, women, and children, who fled brutal conditions on the reservation, hoping that Lance can give them shelter in Sweet Meadows. Unlike the other Shoshone we've seen throughout the film, these are played by actual Native American actors, speaking their own language rather than English. Lance translates to Ori and her mother and to the audience.
They have no milk and the children weep.
Lance seems, at first, bent on refusing their request to stay. That is until Thundercloud rides forward. Lance, in reverent tones, describes him as
greatest hunter and the bravest warrior of us all.
Thundercloud, now an old man, gives a despairing speech about the conditions in which he and his fellow Shoshone live, and we see a mournful close-up emphasizing his now failing eyes. Thundercloud is played by Chief John Bigtree, a veteran Native American actor with a career spanning decades, who'd appeared in many of the films I've already mentioned, including The Iron Horse, The Big Trail, Massacre, and Stagecoach. Devil's Doorway was to be his last ever film role. While I think these scenes are very successful as a general examination of how colonial cultures and viewpoints encounter indigenous ones, there is the question of how accurately and well the film depicts the Shoshone themselves. While I cannot tell this for sure, it's doubtful that Chief John Bigtree is speaking the Shoshone language, given that he was a member of the Seneca Nation from hundreds of miles away. Likewise, the eagle talon rite of passage is unlikely to be authentic, given that the Eastern Shoshone strongly prohibit the harming of eagles. The issue is that Devil's Doorway is ultimately interested in the Shoshone, not as a specific group of people with a specific culture, but as an allegorical stand-in for oppressed peoples more broadly. The film was written and shot in the late 1940s, and is as much about that era as the one in which it was set. In the 40s, many men of different races had just returned home after fighting for their country, much like Lance in Devil's Doorway, only to find that the country they had fought for was none too eager to embrace or reward them. Therefore, many critics have taken Devil's Doorway to be an allegory for the struggles of African Americans and other racial minorities in this period. And so we must ask, is it right to take an actual specific cultural conflict and sand down the edges so that it becomes a more general allegory for oppression? While politically I find Devil's Doorway's conclusions much more radical and interesting than Broken Arrow's, and the gaze it adopts much less condescending, Native Americans are still being framed for the consumption of a white audience, even if that framing rejects a lot of the toxic tropes perpetuated by many other westerns of the era.
Lance, will you come to the house?
Another aspect of the film that is worth discussing is its portrayal of gender.
Well, it wouldn't be a good idea for you to be seen with me after dark.
Ori being a woman creates an interesting tension in the film that's apparent from the moment her and Lance first meet. Female lawyers were not exactly common in the Old West, and Lance is not thrilled by the prospect of engaging one to represent him, even running out of the room when she first introduces herself in her office. She, meanwhile, is clearly apprehensive about taking on a Shoshone as her first client.
My name's Broken Lance. I'm an Indian.
The sequence is incredibly well performed by Robert Taylor and Paula Raymond, as we see the two of them wordlessly realise that the prejudice each feels is mirrored by the other, and that to give in to it would make them hypocritical.
Please sit down.
The film's exploration of the intersection of racism and sexism is unfortunately limited by the fact that none of the Shoshone women are named, and none speaks more than a few snatches of dialogue.
If you ever asked anybody in an audience what an actor said or an actress said, they would never know. But what they have done, or some piece of business, or some moment, they can tell you vividly because they've seen it.
Devil's Doorway was directed by Anthony Mann, who is possibly the greatest director of westerns in classical Hollywood cinema. 1950 was a big year for Anthony Mann's career, with 4 of his films being released in cinemas. Along with Devil's Doorway, there was the noir Side Street and 2 other westerns, The Furies and Winchester 73, starring James Stewart, the latter being an enormous success that kicked off a fruitful multi-film collaboration between Stewart and Mann. While he worked in other genres, throughout the 50s the western became Mann's mainstay, and his later westerns like The Naked Spur and Man of the West are widely considered his best work. Devil's Doorway was his first film in the genre, and it was his last collaboration with the legendary cinematographer John Alton. Alton is known for being one of the architects of the film noir visual style. His later work on John H. Lewis's The Big Combo is considered archetypal of the genre. Prior to Devil's Doorway, Alton and Mann had worked together on many films, including the classic noirs T-Men and Raw Deal. Unlike Devil's Doorway, which was made at major studio MGM, these were B pictures that were made for the Poverty Row studio Eagle Lion Films. However, they proved very successful at the box office and helped launch Mann's career. In these films, Alton and Mann pushed the visual language of noir, the smoke, chiaroscuro lighting, and unusual camera angles, further perhaps than any other filmmakers in that period. At times, Raw Deal, T-Men, and the other noirs Alton and Mann made together have an intense, sometimes nightmarish, phantasmagorical feeling, with the characters practically drowning in smoke and steam. Literally in the case of T-Men, where a character suffers a brutal execution in a sauna. Some of this noir style bleeds into Devil's Doorway. The interiors of the film in particular tend to be filmed in striking high contrast, while Mann and Alton use the smoke of the final battle to generate a similar intense hallucinatory effect as in their previous collaborations. This has led some critics to place the film in the subgenre of the Western noir, along with films like Ramrod, Pursued, Blood on the Moon, and Mann's own The Furies. These films are not just noir in visual style, but also borrow in theme and casting from the genre, with femme fatales and doomed protagonists haunted by their past, played by the likes of Veronica Lake and Robert Mitchum.
It may help to make things easier for you.
The most noir-esque scene in Devil's Doorway is also one of the best. Early on in the film, Lance attempts to drink at a bar with his friend Red Rock, when all of a sudden the room goes silent. The character's eyes and the camera tilt upwards to view a sign which reads, "No liquor for Indians." It was hung by one of the few white men in the town that Lance considers a friend, Zeke, the newly appointed marshal.
Civilization's a great thing,
Zeke scornfully ponders as he leaves the bar. The shot is framed with a remarkable deep focus composition where Lance, Zeke, Red Rock and the bartender are in the centre and background, whilst in the foreground on either side of the frame are the antagonist Coolin and his ally Ike. The two villains casually discuss how the Homestead Act will allow them to turn Lance and the other Shoshone off their land, aiming their conversation pointedly at Lance's ears without mentioning him directly. Things escalate when Ike says,
"There's only one solution to the Indian problem,"
producing his revolver. Ike then shoots the glass of water out of Lance's hand, before firing off shots at Lance's feet and grazing his cheek. Lance, cool-headed, counts off the shots until Ike's empty, and a fistfight ensues. Mann has a way of making all of his fistfights just a bit too long, to the point where all the excitement, drama and tension melt away, and you are left with the sickening sight of two men causing each other immense injury and pain, robbing the protagonist of any sense of glory or heroism when the combat eventually ends in his favour. Throughout the scene, Mann cuts back to the still faces of the bar's other patrons who look passively on as the fight rages. Alton's use of light and shadow in this sequence is a character in itself. The faces of the bystanders have every crag and wrinkle painted in black. The scene contains no music, and is instead underscored by the distant sound of thunder as the storm rolls in. What could otherwise be cliché is enhanced through evocative sound design, where each stroke of thunder is perfectly placed and has just the right level of reverb. The The sparseness of the silence between the thunderclaps and the impact of fist on flesh is haunting. Mann takes this action sequence and makes the true threat not the bullets or punches aimed at the hero, but the apathy and tacit approval of those who stand by while the gears of civilization inevitably grind on, ready to pound him to dust. Broken Lance certainly has one thing in common with the noir hero. He's doomed, and the audience knows it, even if he doesn't. It's written in the thunder.
The old man told you never to waste lead. Now you're short.
Throughout his career, Mann seemed deeply aware of both the limitations and possibilities of classical Hollywood storytelling, and had a fascinating way of using different stylistic elements of film in marked contrast with one another. One example comes in Winchester 73, where at the end of the film, the hero gets the girl, kills the bad guy, and is reunited with his stolen gun. Everything about the music, shot composition, and Shelley Wynter's performance as the love interest who gladly, desperately embraces our hero marks this as a happy ending. Yet in order to bring about this resolution, Stewart's character has had to hunt down and kill his own brother. The impact of this act on his conscience being something that his friend, played by Millard Mitchell, had earlier warned him about.
Hunting a man to kill him? You're beginning to like it.
Well, that's where you're wrong. I don't like it. Some things a man has to do, so he does them.
What happens when the hunt is over? Then what?
Hadn't given it much thought.
The soul-shattered expression on Stewart's face and the brief despairing look he shares with Mitchell confirms that this killing has indeed broken him. The way the music triumphantly swells as we cut to a close-up on the titular gun that Stewart has taken from his brother's corpse plays against the character's own emotions. The effect that Mann creates here is bizarre and unique, an ending that feels deliberately hollow, undermined by its own stylistic dissonance.
Do you believe deep in your heart that they have a right to my land?
This kind of subversion of cliché might be what drew Mann to Guy Trosper's script for Devil's Doorway, which Mann described as the best I have ever read.
I believe everyone has the right to live.
Trosper, who would go on to write the Marlon Brando western One-Eyed Jacks, as well as Birdman of Alcatraz, inverts many of the established tropes of the western in his story. Indeed, there's a moment in Devil's Doorway that seems, incidentally, to respond to Winchester 73. In the latter film, Stewart's character recites some common folk wisdom about Native Americans not fighting at night.
Say, about these Indians. Seems like they hardly ever attack at night.
Why?
Well, they figure if they're killed in the dark, the Great Spirit can't find their souls and whip them up to heaven, something.
The Indians attacking at dawn is a long-standing and apparently false trope perpetuated by many novels and films. In Devil's Doorway, there's a moment where Lance jokes to Red Rock.
Probably get here late this afternoon and hit at night. Indians aren't supposed to be able to fight at night.
While almost certainly not intentional, it's hard not to read this as a kind of intertextual self-criticism.
Sorry if I crowded your beat, cowboy.
Didn't mean to push you up on the sidewalk, but this is cattle country.
One other common trope of Western stories that we see inverted in the film is the conflict between cattle ranchers and those who would put the land to other uses. Many films like The Westerner, Ramrod, and The Furies depict cattle barons who, as the word baron would suggest, view their ownership and domination of the land as a feudal enterprise, where they sit unquestioned at the top of the hierarchy.
It's against the law to build fences hereabouts.
What law? Whose law?
Mine.
The conflicts in these films often revolve around their attempts to ward off those who would use the land to grow crops and graze sheep, as this would ruin the land for cattle.
Hey, corn husk!
He's threatened to bring in sheep. This is cattle country. You know how sheep ruin a country for cattle.
A town of cattlemen, for cattlemen, and by God, run by cattlemen!
These figures, while the antagonists of the films in question, are often depicted ambivalently, simultaneously vilified.
Hang him.
He means me to beg. To beg him for your life.
He sits his stallion, stiff with hate.
And venerated.
I did it! It's still me! I'm still king of the Furies!
Lance has a lot in common with this archetypal figure of the cattle baron. Obviously, he too owns a large stock of cattle, and while it's not explicitly discussed in the film, he certainly seems to be the unquestioned leader and authority figure of Sweet Meadows.
Nothing that way but my land.
But Mr. Coonan said Sweet Meadows
belongs to me.
Meanwhile, his material wealth is repeatedly emphasized in the film.
Hey, what are you going to do with all that money?
Just put it in the bank. Hey, Zeke, did you ever deposit $18,000 in the bank?
As is the economic precarity of the sheep herders who are trying to take his land.
I told you once.
Wait a minute, what can we do? Watch the sheep die and rot in front of our eyes?
Interestingly, according to scholar Joanna Hearn, the screenplay for Devil's Doorway started life as a short story by Trosper called The Drifter. According to Hearn's description, this early version has no theme of racial oppression. Instead, the story centers on the conflict between a cattle baron and small-time ranchers, much like The Westerner and other westerns within this subgenre. Lance Poole, in this version of the story, rather than being a Shoshone war veteran, is a white ranch hand who challenges the authority of the cattle baron. However, it almost seems as though, after a series of revisions and redrafts, traces of the original cattle baron villain can now be found in Devil's Doorway's Native American hero. This leads to a somewhat strange and contradictory coding of Lance in the final version of Devil's Doorway, as simultaneously a Native American righteously defending his land from colonial invasion.
It's hard to explain how an Indian feels about the earth. It's the pumping of our blood. It's the love we've got to have.
And a wealthy landowner hoarding his monopoly on natural resources.
Let's get something straight. The other side of that pass belongs to me. Stay off it.
Perhaps Lance's fatal mistake is that when he attempts to integrate into American society, he tries to find room at the top and not the bottom.
You don't think it's right for an Indian to control 50,000 acres of the best grazing land in Wyoming, now do you, Ike?
A failure to know his place, which must be punished. Devil's Doorway's most notable instance of an inverted Western trope arrives at the end, when Lance and his fellow Shoshone, after a series of skirmishes, have retreated to their homes and erected a barricade around them. Ori has called in the cavalry, hoping they'll protect Lance and the others from being lynched.
United States Cavalry.
The cavalry riding to the hero's rescue from an Indian attack is one of the most well-worn of Western cliches.
It's the bugles! They're blowing the charge!
Perhaps most famously employed in Stagecoach. Here, of course, the cavalry arrives and as ever takes the white man's side, even though this time they are the villains. We then get an incredible sequence, where Ori goes to try and convince Lance to surrender so the surviving Shoshone women and children can be saved.
But what about the women and children in there?
The two of them face each other in his destroyed home, sunlight streaming in through the splintered wood, and beautifully catching the gun smoke in the air. She begs him to give up, telling him she cares not just for the women and children's lives, but his own, implying that she's fallen in love with him. Lance responds, declaring,
If you're trying to say it's feeling for me, then I don't believe you. Color of my hide means just as much to you as it does to them out there.
He dares her to kiss him, pulling her closer towards him as the camera cuts to a close-up of their lips, barely an inch or two apart. The two do not kiss, but the question is provoked. Which would be more daring, to show an interracial kiss, even when one participant isn't the race they are portraying, or to reject the sentimental romantic closure such a kiss would provide? Lance, now defiant, tells Ori he'll fight on to the death.
Tell the lieutenant he'll have to come and get us.
But on the way out, he smiles to her and says kindly,
Don't cry, Ori. 100 years from now, it might have worked.
Leaving the audience to realize that the film was made less than 100 years after it was set. After Ori leaves, the gunfire begins again, and Lance wanders slowly out in a daze. Once the remaining Shoshone warriors are dead, and he himself has been fatally shot, Lance acquiesces to Ori's wish.
We'll give up if you'll let the women and children go back to the reservation.
At the start of the film, his name was Lance Poole, and we saw him in a US Army uniform, a proud American. Over time, we saw him become Broken Lance, shedding his uniform in favor of moccasins and a bandana. Yet in death, he dons the uniform again, striding towards the cavalry officer and saluting.
Where are the others?
gone.
Robert Taylor is often referred to derisively as a matinee idol, famed more for his looks than his acting ability.
The best looking of the new leading men. The boy who is rapidly speeding to stardom, Robert Taylor.
Yet I can't think of many actors capable of delivering that final line in such a haunting way. The ever so slight smile on his face is so wildly counterintuitive, and yet somehow it works perfectly. Between this film and his incredible performance in 1954's Westward the Woman, Taylor deserves to be considered as one of the greatest Western stars of the era.
You know me. Yeah, I know you. That's what I mean.
Several Hollywood westerns in the decades following Devil's Doorway attempted to present a Native American perspective. Just 4 years later came Robert Aldridge's Apache, starring Burt Lancaster as Masai, a warrior who refuses to surrender with the rest of the tribe, escaping instead to continue to struggle against the whites that oppress them. I'm not sure whether it's the fact that the colour photography makes the body paint look that much worse, or if it's that Burt Lancaster is the more recognisable star, but Lancaster's appearance as a Native American seems about 10,000 times more offensive than Robert Taylor's. Additionally, Lancaster speaks in a halting clipped voice, common in depictions of Native Americans at the time.
I saw Nalinne with Hondo, who wears the soldier's coat. I saw Hondo walking in the village and no one spit when he passed by.
Which, coming from a white actor, tips the performance over into caricature. Indeed, one of the most striking things about the performance Taylor gives in Devil's Doorway is the looseness of his expression and movement.
Well, you're going to make us a good foreman someday.
Most white actors, by contrast, portrayed Native Americans with a stiffness bordering on robotic.
Long hair's wood, good wood.
The simple sequences of Lance and his friend Red Rock joking together.
Helps. Somebody grunt for you. Couldn't have finished otherwise.
Lend the characters so much more humanity than those we see in films like Apache.
Masai is a warrior. He does not follow the warpath with thieves and murderers.
In 1964's Cheyenne Autumn, John Ford took a more sympathetic look at Native Americans, and the film is often regarded as an apology for his earlier work. The film follows a band of Cheyenne attempting to make their way from a reservation in the desert, where most of them have died from disease and starvation, back to their home in Wyoming, thousands of miles away. However, the film focuses more on the white characters, chasing, imprisoning, and aiding them, than it does in the Cheyenne themselves, who are mostly portrayed by Mexican actors. Some films in the 1960s made outside of Hollywood had Native American heroes, portrayed by whites of course, like Sergio Corbucci's spaghetti western Navajo Joe, starring Burt Reynolds in the title role, and the East German film The Sons of Great Bear, one of the so-called Red Westerns made by the Soviet Union during the era.
Dann aber wenden wir die Mustangs, noch in der Nacht.
It's an anti-American propaganda film that frames the Native American characters as revolutionary heroes against the evil whites. As interesting as that sounds, the film is unfortunately a load of garbage.
Come out and fight! It is a good day to die!
It wasn't until 1970, and Chief Dan George's great performance in Little Big Man, followed by his Oscar-nominated turn in The Outlaw Josie Wales in '76, that an actual Native American actor got substantial and acclaimed roles in a mainstream Hollywood Western.
I thought you might be someone who would sneak up behind me with a gun.
Later, Cherokee actor Wes Studi and Canadian First Nations actor Graham Greene would receive acclaim in the 90s in films like The Last of the Mohicans and Dances with Wolves.
Aye.
The latter of which landed Greene an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor.
Graham Greene in Dances with Wolves.
These two films were part of a long-running subgenre of Western, where a white male protagonist becomes an honorary Native American. This neatly squares the circle, telling stories about Native Americans that have the required white movie star to sell the film, whilst avoiding the red face that had become politically incorrect by the 1990s. Cherokee actor Wes Studi would also appear as the titular character in the 1993 film Geronimo, an American Legend. In that film, Geronimo struggles against the oppression his people suffer on the reservations, and leads a band who escape and fight their way to Mexico. The film strongly condemns the American treatment of the Apache, portraying massacres and executions committed by white soldiers. Geronimo, meanwhile, is mostly portrayed as a heroic figure, if somewhat morally ambiguous at times. However, in spite of playing the title role and giving a great performance, Wes Studi is still fourth in the billing and lagging behind his more famous white co-stars like Matt Damon, Gene Hackman, and Robert Duvall in terms of screen time. Fundamentally, in spite of its title, this is a film much more interested in white soldiers than Apache warriors. Director Walter Hill even stated that the film should have been called The Geronimo War, to emphasize that the story is more from the Army's point of view.
My compliments, Lieutenant.
The trend of emphasizing white soldiers' perspective on Native American genocide would continue in another film starring Wes Studi from just a few years ago, Hostiles, released in 2017. In the film, Christian Bale's character, an army captain, must escort a Cheyenne war chief played by Studi from New Mexico to Montana. Bale's character is a racist who has committed multiple horrifying genocidal acts in the past. The film's story is fundamentally concerned with his redemption, and Studi's character is mostly a prop to help him achieve it, although Studi himself does give a typically great performance.
God, I'm amazing!
Wes Studi would receive an honorary Academy Award in 2019, presented by his co-star Bale, making him the first Native American to win an Oscar. More recent art house films from various countries have used elements of the Western to explore colonial violence and the exploitation of indigenous peoples. Kelly Reichardt's revisionist feminist Western Meek's Cutoff, Lucrecia Martel's Zama, a surreal portrait of colonialism in Argentina, and Jennifer Kent's grim Antipodean drama The Nightingale, just a few among many examples. And yet there hasn't, to my knowledge, been a film that truly lives up to the promise of Devil's Doorway, a classic Western with a Native American hero, played by a Native American actor. But is such a thing even really desirable? Perhaps Indigenous people are best off telling their own stories, in new ways, not beholden to the strictures of a genre that often depicted them so badly. If you're interested in learning more about Native American portrayals in cinema from the perspective of actual Native American scholars and activists, then the documentary Real Injun gives you just that. It's highly accessible and gives a great alternative history of American cinema, highlighting and celebrating several more recent works by Indigenous filmmakers that fall outside the Western genre. Thanks for listening to the first episode of The Road to Contention. Please join me next time as I take a look at portrayals of women in the classic Hollywood Western, focusing on Nicholas Ray's incredible cult classic, Johnny Guitar.